So with that said, I throw it open to questions and comments now, because I'd rather hear what's on your mind and how we can respond to that. Pass the water. Yeah. There's one right at the back and then one at the front.
There's one right at the back.
All right, we haven't lost you. There's one at the back. We'll take this one first, yeah.
Okay, thanks. I've got a question around the use of the buying solution frameworks.
Yeah.
Members of my team have had some productive meetings with the Efficiency and Reform Group, in particular around encouraging the utilisation of a couple of specific frameworks. The team submitted a paper with some initiatives. Unfortunately, we've not managed to take those forward yet, and certainly from what I've seen, those frameworks are not being, and generally the frameworks aren't being consistently used anywhere near as much as they could, despite the comply or defend policy.
Yeah.
So do you see that as a barrier to driving efficiency in public services in, and if so, what's the plan to overcome that?
Okay, and which department are you?
I'm actually a guest today, so I'm from the dark side, from the private sector.
Fine. Okay. Buying Solutions, for those that don't know, is the centralised group, part of what used to be part of OGC, predominantly based out of Liverpool, some of them in Norwich. And what they do is, in effect, either procure things on behalf of the rest of us or contract framework contracts on behalf of the rest of us. The perception over the past few years is that hasn't worked as well as it might because there's been a proliferation of framework contracts. A lot of suppliers come along and bid for framework contract after framework contract, spend years of their life bidding, finally getting on them, and then nobody uses them. Or if they do use them, it's very low volumes. And I think the argument has been lost on frameworks, really. I think the word framework has now become a bit of a dirty word in procurement speak. Now, it's a necessary part of doing good procurement because you can't run an EU-based competition every time you want to buy, a sheet of paper or something. You have to have the framework deals in place. But what we really want to do is get people aggregating their spend, and so that we can do a deal that's based on the whole of government procurement. And if you want to take a commodity area, I use paper as a sort of silly example, but people buy paper right across government. Does anybody care where they buy their paper from? Probably some people do, but if so, I'd rather not have dinner parties with them. The rest of us just want to get paper to use for our printing or whatever it is. If we aggregate the bulk purchasing power of paper, we can go and do the deal of all deals with somebody, a Canadian paper mill or something, and then we can load that framework into everybody's procurement operation, and then they can buy, even if they want to buy one box of paper, they get the same price as though they were aggregating the spend. That's the kind of model that we want to get out there. So what we're trying to turn Buying Solutions into is the place that does that once on behalf of government procurement. And then the contracts the deals that they do, whether you want to call them frameworks or not, then get transferred to procurement centres, and from there individual departments and ultimately wider public sector bodies get the advantage of bulk purchasing power. Energy, I already referred to, is the first example of that. It's shown us the way. We now need to do it with another 10 or 12 categories. Yeah, at the back.
Hi, Nick Jones from the COI. We do a lot of work with Cabinet Office on data.gov.uk and transparency.
Yep.
What reflections do you have on the last couple of months of very transparent publication of data around this area, and are there any limits to transparency?
Not much and yes. No. Seriously, transparency, I think, is a theology that a lot of people in the coalition hold very close to their heart. They actually think the way to make things improve is not to try and manage them and tightly from the centre, but actually just to make the information available and allow the public pressure that comes from that to put pressure on the system to reform. They also believe that by making information available in a transparent way, you stimulate new entrepreneurial ideas, whether they're hard commercial or more social enterprise ideas. They would like to see both coming from that. So they believe in it very strongly. It's not going to go away. I don't know how far the limits of transparency go, but I've always taken the view that unless it was really life and death national security, it's probably going to get found out anyway. And you're always better off making it public in the first place than you are trying to defend it. Used to have this discussion a lot about the reviews of government, not quite the territory you're in, but when we did the capability review program, we made a decision up front that we would publish the results. As a result, we got a lot less hassle from them than otherwise would have occurred on something like gateway reviews, where people went to court in the end in order to be able to defend their right not to publish them. And for me, that's a nugatory effort. I'd rather do something, get the information out there, allow the public to react in whatever way is possible, which usually is so, don't really care about that, thank you very much. But in occasions, they get really onto something and then create pressure on the system. And do you think the MP's expenses would have got to the position they had been if many years ago they'd published them routinely, or in the end it was, albeit a leak, it became public domain? It's created pressure on a system to reform itself. There's a huge debate going on at the moment over the WikiLeaks thing, where I think even today, the data activists are targeting people who are seen to be trying to block WikiLeaks from publishing. So yes, there are limits, because WikiLeaks has got into places which potentially cause people to lose their lives, and I think there are boundaries. But I think the direction of travel has got to be more and more transparency. So rather than resist it or whinge about it, I think we'd better get behind it and work out how we can make our information transparent, easily, reliably, and with least overhead from internally in order to get that information out there. Yeah? So it's one at the back and one at the front. One at the back right and one front.
Peter Telford from Research Council Shared Service Centre.
Sorry, from where?
Research Council Shared Service Centre.
Yeah.
You talk about the tight framework, which I fully understand from a shared service perspective, and the operational excellence. Clearly there are organisational, cultural barriers there, and then you referred to the glacial speed that some shared service centres have been moving, and I just wondered how you would accelerate that activity. Yeah,
I mean, I know about yours is the one down in Swindon, isn't it, that operates on behalf of the research councils, and which Biz, I think, have been talking about whether they're going to use as their shared service. I mean, one of the good examples I would use. What is the cultural change about shared service? I'll tell you, the cultural change is that you don't need, in any government or any other organisation, to run everything yourself that you're going to use. And unfortunately, I think we've got a culture that if you don't control it, it's bound to be a problem. So I say to people, you don't actually run your own telephone exchange, do you? You kind of rely on somebody else to do that for you, you just use it. And of course, people say, well, of course that's right. And the problem we have in shared services is we've never got people to trust the fact that the service they would get from the shared service is going to be at least as good and preferably better and hopefully and definitely cheaper than that which they would do themselves. And I can give you loads of examples where I think that hasn't happened, but mostly it's a fear of contracting something out that you think is really important to you. And so you dip your toe in the water, and as you all know, if you dip your toe in icy cold water and then dip a bit more of your body in, you get cold for quite a long, prolonged period, and then you withdraw. Whereas if you just dive straight in, you quite often, it's 5 seconds of cold, and then you're sort of adjusted. And the problem we have is they've dipped their toe in the water and said, oh, I don't really like this very much, I'm going to stop there. So we have shared services that just do transactions. Now, if you just do transactions, nobody's going to get much benefit out of it. If you actually start to get real value parts of the service into the shared service, so that I'm a government department, you're a shared service provider, you don't just provide me with my general ledger and financial transactions, you actually provide me with my finance function, then I think you start to get a much more strategic use of shared services in a way that means you get a professionalised finance function delivered to a department, rather than which is fundamentally focused, I don't know, on what, health or something, rather than the department itself having to worry about its own finance function and how it builds a cadre of people who can do finance. So I think shared services is about being bolder rather than being quicker. I think it's about doing more of the service, putting more of the service into the shared service model so that departments have a greater reliance on the shared service provider, who in then has a greater incentive to provide a really top quality service. And that, I think, is the fundamental for moving it in a sensible direction. One at the front, and then probably take one more after that, and then...
Good morning, Deborah Carter, Welsh Assembly Government. You mentioned earlier about doing things differently as a major source of efficiency. I'd just be interested in your thoughts on the connect between that and doing different things in terms of the kinds of public services we're delivering, and how we make sure that we are actually connecting up the process efficiency and the actual delivery efficiency.
Yeah. I mean, whenever you start with this generic discussion, if you want to try and do things differently, the first question to ask is, should government do it at all? And I don't think we asked that question enough, actually. We used to do that a lot more in previous eras than we do in the last 10 or 12 years. And if you were to talk to some of the central government, central number 10 types who are really enthusiastic about this, they would argue that we should stop doing a lot of stuff that we actually do in government. And this is where the so-called notion of big society emerges from, which is government shouldn't be the automatic solution to every problem in a community. Actually, what government should do is maybe step back a bit and allow the local community to fill that vacuum. Now, that's a risky political strategy. I've heard people describe it as like a kid riding a bike. They ride the bike with stabilizers before. That's what people categorize as previous regime bike riding. You take the stabilizers off, the kid falls over and gets a bloody knee, but then kicks on and then starts riding the bike off into the sunset. I mean, that's that kind of cartoon version of big society. The problem is, what will ministers do when the equivalent of the child has the bloody knee because they've withdrawn back from something? And that is a test of the political will, it seems to me. From an official point of view, I think we should be helping them identify those areas where we don't need to be the provider of that solution, but we may be the enabler of that solution for local community areas to come in. When we then talk about the things that we do have to do, I think we have to question fundamentally, are we doing it the right way, as opposed to whether we're doing it or not. And a good example of that would be we have seen a massive growth in the last 10 years inside government, obviously and globally, in the use of the internet as a way of providing services and solutions. We do some really great things. DirectGov has 34 million people a month using it for its transactional services. Fantastic. The problem is we haven't shut much down of the old ways of doing things. And so we're introducing the new without decommissioning the old. And as a result, we end up actually with arguably a better solution in some senses, that different people get what they want, but a much more expensive solution. And so I think an example of the second type of change is we are going to do it, but let's do it in a fundamentally different way. Let's close the old channels, move to the new, accept there's a change to be managed through that. But having got there, then we've got something that's kind of modern and cheaper in order to provide it. And I think they're the two best sort of answers I can give to that question. One more, last question. Any more to go?
I'm going to ask the last
Go
question,
on, then.
if I may.
You may, Jane.
My question actually comes from the responses that you all gave earlier on to one of the questions, which is that people have confidence that plans are underway to enable the people to meet the deficit reduction plan, but they're not quite confident that it's real yet and can be realised. Now, I would imagine that most people in this room are involved and engaged in doing their corporate plan for next year. And people tend to feel more confident about the future when they've got a plan that they can see will actually realise what they need to do, saving to spend and all those good things. On the basis that those plans are put in place, if departments or agencies have plans which actually meet the objectives, how does that work with the tight, loose policy? Is that then accepted and that plan can be executed, or does it still fall within additional constraints? And I know that in coffee beforehand, a number of people were talking about this, though it didn't come up in the question and answer forum.
I think the starting point that you all have is your own departmental plans, but you also answered to one of those questions. You think the majority savings are going to come from cross-departmental activity. And I don't think it is the job of the centre to micromanage your individual plans, but I do think it is the job of the centre to try to get, and if necessary, mandate people to do things in a joined-up way for the good of the whole, even though on an individual basis they may prefer not to do that. And I think, therefore, that the role of the centre should develop into how do we create those ideas and concepts and solutions that work across departments and across agencies, and not just mandate them, because it's no way to run anything. It's just to say, do it because I say so. It's actually to get people into the tent of wanting to do it that way. The best example this year was the commercial supply renegotiations, when Francis Maud said, I'm going to get company X, numbers 1 to 20, in, and we're going to renegotiate. He was absolutely shouted at by everybody in Whitehall, most of whom said, you're cutting across our ability to deal with our own suppliers, to people saying, we've already got the best deal, this is a complete waste of time, there's no more deal to be got out of this, blah, blah, blah. But he mandated it in order to force it to happen, but has then delivered £800 million worth of savings back to the individual departments who said they already had the best deal. One of the PERMSECs said to me, it's been the most troubling few months of my career, Ian, because the first half of it I was so angry at what was going on, and the second half of it I was so disappointed with myself for having been so angry, because the results have been there to see. And I think that's what we have to do from the centre. If I try and tell the Department of X how to micromanage something, how to run something way out there, it's just not going to work. But if I can say to people, you want to do this, but we know over there somebody else is already doing it, we're not going to let you do the same thing, even though you probably think you can do it better than they can. You've got to come together and do it once on behalf of government. Then I think we have an opportunity in the end to add value to the system and achieve more efficiency. And if people see that working, then I think they will buy into it. If it doesn't work, obviously, then it will be resisted on the ground. Does that make sense?
It does.
Can I just close by saying two things. First of all, thank you to our sponsors from Visa. I think a very interesting presentation, and they know what we look a lot across the pond at what the US are doing all the time, just to make sure that we can learn from them and they can learn from us, and there's a lot of synergy. But the second thing is, if everybody here primarily represents a department or an arm's length body or a piece of the wider public sector, it's you guys that will actually cause the efficiency and reforms to happen. We can only stimulate that, and in the end, it will come from you applying these things to your daily job. That's what will make the difference, not what we do in the centre. And I know that, and I know you know that, really. The reason I say it is because sometimes it doesn't always appear that people in the centre believe that there's trust out there in the system. I think if we can give you the tools and the ideas and the concepts and the frameworks in which to operate, it ought to be possible for you guys to come together and do things in a different way, make the whole system better and cost less money, which is all we can afford at this time. So, with that said, I'd like to thank you for listening.